Just before noon, a disturbance rippled through the ranks. A small group of civilians stumbled out of a side gate, apparently forced out by Cersei's guard. They were tattered, frightened, and obviously intended as a living shield. Men, women, and children were herded out at the point of Lannister spears, told to rush the Targaryen lines for safety. In the confusion, a volley of arrows flew from the city ramparts, striking the ground around the fleeing crowd, an act of intimidation that sent them careening toward the Targaryens in blind panic. Daenerys and Jon rushed to the front, ordering their soldiers to lower weapons and let the refugees pass. Sobbing, trembling, they collapsed behind the Targaryen lines, some wounded by arrows. It was a monstrous tactic, one that revealed Cersei's utter disregard for her own people's lives. That was the turning point. Daenerys looked upon the terrified faces, the children who wept in their mother's arms, and anger coursed through her like molten steel. Tyrion saw that fury in her eyes and feared it. He stepped forward as if to counsel restraint, but it was Jon's voice that reached Daenerys first. "We end this," he said, "but we do it cleanly. We break through, we take the Red Keep, and we stop her once and for all. No more games." Daenerys breathed in sharply, then nodded, her fists clenched. With orders given, Grey Worm led the Unsullied in a disciplined, methodical advance on the gates. Under heavy Lannister arrow fire, they raised shields, forming a testudo that inched forward. Catapults hurled stones at the ramparts, forcing archers to take cover. The Dothraki, impatient for battle, began circling the city to test weaknesses in the walls and draw defenders away from the main gate. Meanwhile, Daenerys and Jon mounted their dragons. Jon, lacking the same intuitive bond with Rhaegal that Daenerys shared with Drogon, nonetheless managed to guide him carefully. They soared above the battlefield, scanning for scorpions and signaling the ground forces where to push. It wasn't long before the Lannisters realized that the Targaryens intended a conventional breach, not a fiery massacre from the sky. With the scorpions on the battlements fixated upward, Grey Worm squads managed to press against the main gate. A battering ram of heavy oak and iron splintered the first set of doors. Bolts streaked past the dragons, a few grazing Rhaegal's flanks. He roared, veering left. Daenerys and Drogon retaliated, but she targeted only the battlements and scorpions, sending blasts of dragonfire to clear the walls of the lethal weapons. She refused to send wide streams of flame into the civilian-packed streets beyond. Her restraint was clear to any observer. The city was not being indiscriminately burned. The gates soon gave way under the relentless pounding. The Unsullied surged forward, disciplined as ever. Behind them, a wave of Northmen followed, led by Ser Davos and Brienne of Tarth, her white cloak stained with dust and sweat. The Lannisters inside, though resolute, began to give ground under the onslaught. Street by street, the Targaryen forces advanced, skirmishing with Lannister soldiers who fought desperately, perhaps believing Cersei's promise of no surrender. Smoke drifted through the air from the destroyed scorpions, and the sound of distant screams and clashing steel echoed off the stone walls. When the Targaryen host finally reached the central plaza leading up to the Red Keep, they encountered the Golden Company's main force. Harry Strickland and his cavalry held the choke point. Their lines were formidable, shining with polished armor, golden banners snapping in the wind. But morale was faltering amid the horrors of the day. Daenerys and Jon landed their dragons just behind their own lines, to the awe of soldiers on both sides. Grey Worm formed up, ready to press the attack. Jon swung off Rhaegal's saddle, sword in hand. Daenerys dismounted Drogon with regal bearing, her silver hair tousled by flight, eyes aflame with determination. For a heartbeat, both armies paused, uncertain, as if feeling the weight of history pivoting on this moment. Daenerys stepped forward, speaking in a voice that rang clearly across the plaza. "The reign of Cersei Lannister ends today. Surrender your arms, and you shall live. We will not punish those who lay down their weapons. Harry Strickland, your contract need not bind you to a lost cause." Her words carried a fierce nobility, but also a measure of mercy. Behind her, Drogon roared, smoke curling from his nostrils. The tension was almost unbearable. If Strickland refused, the plaza would erupt in bloody combat. The sight of two dragons, combined with the knowledge that the gates had fallen, seemed to weigh heavily on Strickland. He clenched his jaw, glancing at his men. He had gambled on Cersei's gold and the possibility of a quick victory, but now he faced not only the infamous mother of dragons but her new husband, the rumored heir Aegon Targaryen, with a vast host at their backs. Strickland bowed his head, tossing down his sword. One by one, the Golden Company soldiers followed suit, dropping their weapons with muted clangs onto the cobblestones. An exhalation of relief swept the Targaryen lines. Daenerys nodded once, a slight motion acknowledging their surrender. "Open the gates of the Red Keep," she commanded, "and let us end this without more bloodshed." The battered remains of the Golden Company moved aside, allowing Targaryen and northern forces to pass. Beyond the final gates, inside the Red Keep's outer courtyard, stood Cersei's last loyal guards. They refused to surrender. The clang of steel erupted as Grey Worm led a swift, brutal engagement. Jon strode beside him, Longclaw flashing as he parried a Lannister halberd, then drove the pommel into another soldier's helm. Daenerys stood back with Drogon, trusting Jon and Grey Worm to subdue the last defenders. In short order, the courtyard was secured. The path to the throne room lay open. Within the hall of the Iron Throne, the hush was absolute. The sun streamed in through the high windows, illuminating the twisted swords that made up the seat of kings. And there stood Cersei Lannister, dressed in her regal black and gold, her crown perched atop carefully coiffed hair. Her face was pale with tension, and her eyes flickered with defiance, and perhaps a hint of fear. Beside her towered Ser Gregor Clegane, a hideous visage in dark armor. Qyburn lingered off to one side, his lips pressed thin. Daenerys advanced into the throne room, her boots echoing against the cold stone floor. Jon and Grey Worm flanked her. Tyrion followed, gazing at his sister with undisguised contempt. Cersei's posture stiffened. She would not cede an inch. "You dare come before me in my own hall," she said, voice dripping with venom, "to steal the throne that is rightfully mine." Daenerys regarded her, not without a touch of pity. "Your reign has brought suffering to the realm. You had your chance to surrender. Instead, you used your people as shields, forced children into the streets. That is no ruler's way." She gestured to Jon and Grey Worm, who stood ready. "Your soldiers have laid down their arms. The city is ours. No one else needs to die today." Cersei's chin jutted out in defiance. "You know nothing of ruling, Targaryen. Power is not won by weakness. The minute you show mercy, your enemies will use it to destroy you." Jon stepped forward, anger flaring. "This isn't mercy for its own sake," he said. "It's what a true king and queen do. They protect the realm, not burn it." He raised his sword, leveling it at Ser Gregor. "Stand down. Your fight is over. There's no more point to this bloodshed." The mountain stirred, a silent threat, but Cersei's hand came up, halting him for the moment. In that pause, Tyrion seized the opportunity. "Cersei," he implored, voice trembling with a mixture of scorn and sorrow, "you've lost. Do not drag the city down with you. The realm doesn't need more corpses. It needs peace." A swirl of possibilities flickered through Cersei's eyes. Rage, desperation, cunning, and a fierce will to survive. She looked at Daenerys, who stood with regal poise, chin slightly lifted, the rightful queen that many believed she was born to be. She looked at Jon Snow, who had proven his nobility time and again, and who now wore the name Targaryen as though it carried the weight of centuries. Slowly, a crack appeared in her composure. The reality of defeat was undeniable, but she still clung to her pride. She raised her hand as if to issue an order, but it shook. For a moment, words failed her. Qyburn stepped forward, attempting to speak on her behalf, but he was silenced by a single, commanding stare from Grey Worm, who still held a bloodied spear. At last, Cersei found her voice. "You are fools," she hissed. "All of you. You think this throne is something to be claimed like a trophy. but it devours those who sit upon it. Consumed my father, your father, my children. It will consume you as well." Daenerys took another step, her tone tempered with solemn authority. "If so, then let the throne consume me, but I will try to break the wheel of endless cruelty before it does. Surrender your crown, or Ser Gregor will not stop us from taking it." She extended a hand, as if to physically demand the crown from Cersei. A moment's breath, then two. Ser Gregor advanced, sword raised. But Jon was there, crossing blades with the monstrous knight in a jarring collision of steel. Sparks flew, and the clang echoed fiercely in the great chamber. Grey Worm dashed forward to assist, while Tyrion moved aside, shouting at his sister to yield. In a swift movement, Jon sidestepped one of the mountain's swings. Grey Worm lunged, thrusting his spear into the gaps of Clegane's armor. With combined effort, they forced the giant knight off balance. The mountain stumbled, a guttural roar emerging from beneath his helm. But even then, he fought like a cornered beast. It took a final slash from Jon, severing a strap of the knight's helm and revealing a glimpse of the necrotic horror beneath, before Grey Worm's spear found the chink in the armor at the base of the skull. Ser Gregor collapsed with a thud that shook the floor. The fight was over in seconds, but the tension reverberated as if hours had passed. Cersei stared at the fallen mountain with wide, disbelieving eyes. Qyburn went pale, stepping backward. A hush swallowed the hall. Jon, breathing hard, turned to Cersei, leveling Longclaw at her. "Don't force this to end in your blood as well," he rasped. "Yield." A quiver of fear flickered across Cersei's face, warring with her hatred. Then, slowly, she sank to her knees, as though her body were too heavy to support itself. In trembling fury, she lifted the crown from her head and placed it on the stone floor. The clang echoed ominously. She bowed her head, and in that act, she conceded everything she had fought so viciously to keep. Tyrion exhaled a breath he had not realized he was holding. Grey Worm stepped forward to secure her, while Qyburn offered no resistance, only a bitter scowl as he was taken into custody. Daenerys Targaryen, the mother of dragons, stood before the Iron Throne that day not as a conqueror who had destroyed the city in flames, but as a queen who had won it through a blend of determination, strategy, and restraint. Her fury had been tempered by Jon Snow's steadfastness and her own desire not to become another tyrant. She turned to look at Jon, who still held his sword at the ready. Their eyes met, and in that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. They had done what many believed impossible: taken King's Landing without unleashing a massacre. Tyrion picked up the fallen crown from the floor, regarding it with a mixture of reverence and distaste. "Your Grace," he said quietly, approaching Daenerys. She stepped closer to the Iron Throne, running her hand over the twisted metal of the swords that had been hammered together centuries ago. The seat that had been at the heart of so much bloodshed and heartbreak in Westeros now stood within her reach. Carefully, Tyrion placed the crown in her hands. She looked at it for a long moment before lifting it and placing it upon her head. She settled onto the Iron Throne, the chilled metal biting through her cloak. A hush fell over those assembled, and the hush turned into a profound silence when Jon sheathed Longclaw and knelt before her. In that moment, she saw not a challenge to her reign, but a partner who had fought beside her, one who had married her not for power but for unity. And so she leaned forward, gently lifting him by the shoulders, a sign that he need not kneel to her. Not anymore. Grey Worm and the Unsullied bowed in solemn respect. The Northern Bannermen, though some wore reluctant expressions, followed suit. Tyrion, tears brimming in his eyes, lowered his head as well. The realm had a new queen and king. Though Jon declined any formal coronation for himself, the people murmured that he was the second head of the dragon. Together, they had broken Cersei's hold on King's Landing. In the days that followed, Daenerys oversaw the delicate process of restoring order. She ordered a distribution of grain stores to the starving citizens, freeing political prisoners, and assessing the damage. Jon worked tirelessly to keep the northern soldiers from harassing the city dwellers, reminding them this city would now be their capital, not an enemy stronghold. Tyrion was charged with reorganizing the courts, and Grey Worm maintained guard over the Red Keep. They had a queen who possessed dragons and a fierce determination to rule justly, and they had a man, once a bastion of the North, who brought an unyielding sense of honor to the realm's governance. Many wondered if this tenuous peace could last, but for now, hope blossomed in the streets. People whispered that perhaps a Targaryen queen, tempered by a Stark king in all but name, might steer Westeros away from the cycle of tyranny. Cersei was imprisoned, awaiting a decision on her fate. Some called for her execution, citing the deaths she'd caused and the cruelty she'd inflicted. Others, including Tyrion, argued that showing mercy might set a different precedent for the realm. Daenerys deliberated for days, aware that whatever choice she made would define her reign. Ultimately, at Jon's urging, she decided that Cersei would stand trial before a newly formed tribunal of lords and representatives from across the realm, an attempt at impartial justice. It was a risky choice, one that might anger those who demanded swift retribution, but Daenerys believed that a new age required a new way of handling old debts. Slowly, life began to trickle back into King's Landing. Market stalls reopened, and though the war had left scars across the city, people dared to imagine a future. Highgarden sent supplies, the North pledged men to help rebuild broken walls, and Dorne expressed cautious support, forging new alliances in the wake of the Lannister downfall. In the Great Hall of the Red Keep, Daenerys held audiences, listening to the pleas and petitions of commoners, dispensing justice with as much fairness as she could muster. By her side, Jon offered quiet counsel, forever the voice of compassion and practicality. He no longer had any desire to leave for the distant north. The vow he had made to Daenerys, to remain by her side, to ensure she did not lose herself, bound him here. One evening, after another grueling day of audiences, Daenerys retreated to the royal chambers, where she found Jon gazing out the window at the city lights flickering below. He turned as she entered, a faint smile touching his lips. "How are you holding up, Your Grace?" he teased gently. She rolled her eyes, though a smile played across her own lips. "Your Grace," she echoed, shaking her head. "You're the one who's truly a Targaryen." He closed the distance between them, taking her hands in his. "Blood doesn't make the throne. A heart does, and your heart is what will see Westeros through." She leaned against him, feeling the warmth of his body through his leather jerkin. For a moment, they were just two people who had fought and survived unimaginable horrors, who had lost friends and allies, and who had found each other. Her mind flickered back to the nightmares she had once harbored, that she might turn into a tyrant, that perhaps Jon would be forced to kill her should she succumb to madness. Yet here they stood. His arms were around her, protective, gentle, reassuring in the darkness. "You once swore you'd keep me from becoming a monster," she whispered. "I'm counting on you to keep that vow." He pressed his brow to hers. "I swore it and I meant it," he said. "You're not alone, Daenerys. You never have to be." Outside the window, Drogon and Rhaegal perched high on a parapet, their eyes scanning the starlit skies, guardians of this realm reborn. The moonlight bathed the city in a pale glow, revealing roofs and cobblestones still scarred by war, but also showing signs of renewal. People moved about, carrying torches or lanterns, clearing debris, giving comfort to neighbors. In that quiet tapestry of flickering light, Daenerys and Jon found a fleeting peace. Though challenges surely lay ahead, diplomatic quarrels, rebellious lords unwilling to accept the Targaryen restoration, the uncertain reaction of the Iron Islands without Euron's leadership, there was a sense of possibility that had once seemed unthinkable. Daenerys would not be forced to choose between love and the throne, for love had guided her to claim the throne with restraint rather than fury. Jon would not slay the woman he cared for her path had never strayed so far into darkness that it left him no alternative. Their marriage, once seen as a mere political convenience by some, had become a genuine alliance of hearts and spirits, a synergy that kept each grounded when the burdens of the crown became too heavy to bear alone. In the months that followed, their rule took shape. The seeds of a new governance were sown as representatives from each region came to the capital, enticed by the promise of having a voice in rebuilding the Seven Kingdoms. Amid ongoing discussions of reform, questions of inheritance, the place of the faith, the restructuring of the City Watch, Daenerys found in Jon a partner who bridged the gap between her supporters and the Northern Lords who still remembered the old Targaryen conquest with unease. Tyrion's clever mind provided the scaffolding upon which a new realm might stand. Grey Worm, though grieving the losses of many unsullied, served loyally, ensuring the discipline of the newly formed city garrison. Sansa Stark, seeing the genuine change in Daenerys and witnessing the city's relief at being spared from utter devastation, began to lend her political acumen to the cause, albeit warily at first. The realm was a tapestry slowly being rewoven, each stitch a compromise or an aspiration towards something better, and in that tapestry, Daenerys and Jon shone as its central figures, forging a new kind of monarchy that sought not only to command but to listen. The rumor of her mercy spread, weaving legends among the small folk of how the Dragon Queen had not burned them when she could have. The rumor of his unwavering honor circulated, reminding folk that not all Targaryens were destined to descend into madness. For each new day, each new test of their leadership, be it a rebellious lord or a sudden threat from the Iron Islands, they met it hand in hand. Sometimes their differences caused friction. Daenerys' dragonfire approach to threats clashed with Jon's measured stoicism. Yet they balanced each other out, and in the balance they found a stable measure of rule.